Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Hands Where I Can See Them, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by FlyingBlueBirds, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Britt. Hands Where I Can See Them. Chapter 17. For fuck's sake, Sarah. So, that's it, huh? We really got her? It's over? Sarah couldn't believe that she was actually asking this. After all this time, she never would have expected that these words would ever leave her lips. It felt completely surreal, like some sort of fever dream. Yet, here she was. She sank a little bit deeper into the cushion of the bar chair she was currently sitting on, and grabbed onto the wooden table in front of her, as she needed to remind herself that all of this was in fact real. But the wood felt solid under her fingers, and no matter how hard she pinched herself, the world didn't start to blur in front of her eyes. She didn't wake up. I mean, it's too soon to be sure, but it all looks like it. Nikta, who was sitting opposite her, shrugged, apparently not affected at all by the recent events. But Sarah knew that her indifference was nothing more than a facade, and deep down she was just as overwhelmed with everything that had happened today. It all feels a little too good to be true. Sarah's own doubt was clearly audible in her voice, and no matter how much she wanted to, Nikta couldn't disagree with her. It does, but I guess sometimes all it takes is a little bit of luck. So let's drink to that. Nikta raised the glass in front of her and toasted in Sarah's direction. Here's to luck. To luck, Sarah responded, and a small smile appeared on her face. And to the fact that this case has actually managed to get the two of us to drink together again. If someone would have told me a couple of months ago that I would end up in a bar with Detective Nikta Batan, I wouldn't have believed it. Nikta escaped a quiet laugh, but once more she couldn't really argue with Sarah. Instead, she decided to throw some more sass at the other detective. You know, I'm actually an incredibly fun person. Have you met yourself? Sarah's dry response made Nikta raise both of her eyebrows in mocking offense. How rude. But I guess the first part you said is actually true. So here's to luck, and to us drinking together again. She raised her glass a little higher and sent a knowing smirk Sarah's way before she continued. And to Detective Tally Craven, because I can't believe she actually did that. At the mention of Tally's name, Sarah felt herself stiffen, and the dark shadow ghosted over her face. She did her best to conceal the effect the sole mention of her partner's name had on her, but suddenly, her heart felt very heavy, apparently still longing for something it just couldn't have. In an attempt to push all of these unwelcomed emotions back down, she wordlessly clinked her glass with Nikta's, then downed the alcohol inside with one sip. I have to admit that was quite the number you pulled on her. If Nikta noticed the way Sarah smiled tightened at her words, she knew better than to point it out. Instead, she let out a low, amused chuckle and waited silently for Sarah's response. To be honest, I can't believe it actually worked, Sarah shrugged. I mean, we knew Kara Brandt was very likely involved in all of this. The mysterious sister of a more than suspicious barkeeper, who happens to be the owner of the one place that seems to tie most of our victims together, is definitely a bit too much of a coincidence. But if we would have confronted her with our suspicions, or would have arranged a lineup together with Craven, she would have known what we were up to the second we would have asked her to say that all witches must burn sentence Craven had heard. I'm pretty sure she would have been smart enough to disguise her voice somehow, and just like that our only advantage would have been gone. No. Our only chance was to catch her off guard. And that was only possible if neither she nor Craven had any idea what was going on. Inviting Brand to the police department under false pretenses, and having her accidentally bump into Craven seemed to be a smart move. Turned out I was right. Thinking back, Sarah knew that her plan had been flawed. Too many variables could have gone wrong. Too much coincidence. Too much luck. Nothing that Sarah would have suggested a couple of months ago. But it was moments like these that made her realize that no matter how much she was trying to deny it, working with Craven had actually taught her to think outside the box, and dared her to do things she normally wouldn't. Well, unless, of course, that thing was a certain redhead that just wouldn't leave her mind. But in the end, everything had worked perfectly. To be fair, Tully might have overdone it slightly by announcing their main suspect loud enough for the whole department, and potentially even the direct neighbors to hear, but it had done the trick. They had gotten their proof, and enough witnesses could vouch for Tally being completely unaware of what had been going on. Kara Brand had been furious when Nick had clicked the handcuffs around her wrists, a grim smile on her face, and had led her right back into the interrogation room. The effect her actions had on their suspect had been immediate. Within a split second, the woman had undergone a complete personality change. Gone had been the polished yet cooperative and professional businesswoman that seemed ever so eager to help them. Instead, Kara Brandt's whole facial expression, her body language, and the tone of her voice had turned completely cold and bare of any emotion. She had refused to testify and had asked for a lawyer immediately. Nick had then spent another hour with her in the interrogation room, desperate to get something out of the woman. But she had not caved in, had not reacted to any of the triggers Nick had tried to plant inside of her head, had not stepped into any of the traps she had laid out for her. Sarah had watched the whole process from the outside. Her fingers had itched, desperate to do something, eager to get her hands on that stone-cold bitch, and barely able to contain the raging fire inside of her. For now, though, Petra had put her on the sidelines and had reminded her, quite determined, that there was a reason why Nick had been put in charge. And no matter how much Sarah had wanted to burst into that room and get some answers out of that woman, with whatever means necessary, she had to admit that Petra was right. She had understood that for now, it was best for her to stay in the back, no matter how hard it was. Her time with Kara Brand would come, and oh, how she was looking forward to it. Sarah had been so lost in her own thoughts that she had almost forgotten that she was still sitting in that bar with Nikta, who was now eyeing her curiously. Sarah knew that teasing smile that had appeared on her face all too well, and was sure nothing good would come out of it. Can't gut your tongue, Sarah? Or are you back at daydreaming about dimples, red hair, and brown eyes? The look on Sarah's face told Nikta more than any words could have. Gotcha, she grinned. Drop it, Nikta, Sarah all but growled warningly. But of course, Nikta did not drop it. Come on, Sarah, stop denying it. Everyone with two eyes can see that you're head over heels for that girl. I am not. Sarah, please. Nikta, I am telling you I don't. Nikta raised her hand and silenced Sarah before she could even finish her sentence. But No, I'm not having it. Then, finally, Sarah buried her head in her hands, obviously defeated, and let out a frustrated groan. Batan, I swear to Goddess, you're impossible. Doesn't mean I'm wrong. Sarah offered herself another drink and rolled her eyes. Okay, maybe I think that Craven is very attractive. And maybe, just maybe, I also have some feelings for her that might not be entirely platonic. So what? So what? Nikta mustered Sarah with a gaze that was firm enough to make anyone else flinch. Sarah, however, remained completely unimpressed, which didn't stop Nikta from continuing her lecture. That's what I'm asking you, Sarah. So, what's stopping you from telling her? You know it's not that easy. Yes, it's not that easy, because you are making things difficult. You've always used the Camarilla killer as an excuse. This is a valid reason, I give you that. But now that she seems to be out of the picture, what's left? What's still holding you back? Just at that moment, Sarah's drink arrived, and she could not have been more grateful. She grabbed it and downed it in one go, then tried her best to keep her voice neutral, but couldn't quite hide the tone of despair in it, when her next words were out of her mouth before she could stop herself. I tried, okay? I tried telling her, and I messed up because once more I just couldn't let go. She and I, we are done. I missed my chance. She did. She truly did. And it hurt so much more than she was ever willing to admit out loud. She could still feel the coldness that had washed over her heart when the full meaning of Tally's words at the graveyard had settled in. She'd been desperate to fix things between them, and Sarah wished she would have been able to truly let go, to reassure Tally that she would not let her down again, that she was her main priority now. In the end, she couldn't tell what had hurt more, her own realization that Tally's words were true, or the look on Tally's face when Sarah had confirmed her theory. She had not tried to run after Tally when she had turned around, had not tried to fix what she had just ruined, had not tried to correct her own words. There simply had been no point. So instead, Sarah had remained in front of her sister's grave, once more completely on her own. She had tried to get her breathing under control, had tried to stop the tears from streaming down her face, but she hadn't even managed to do that. She had turned around, had faced the cold stone, the earth, that had once been what she had loved most in this world, and was now nothing more than a reminder of her own failure. Her voice had dropped, had been so quiet that nobody except herself had been able to hear the whispered words. You would have loved her, Elizabeth. You would have loved the way she challenges me every day, and how despite all of my flaws, she keeps seeing only the best of me. And you know what the worst thing is? I think I do too. One last silent tear had made its way down her cheek when she had closed her eyes and had continued to whisper, I could really use your advice right now. I miss you. Goddess, I miss you so much. She had not received a reply. Of course she hadn't, and there was no point anyway. Tally was gone. But when she had heard the sound of the handcuffs clicking around Kara Brand's wrist a couple of hours later, the first thing she had felt had not been satisfaction or triumph, not even relief. It had been worry. Worry about Tally, about the fact that the sound of Kara's voice might have triggered something inside of her, might have brought back some memories she had managed to repress so far. Worry about what Tally would think of her when she would find out that she had once more only been a token in Sarah's game. But when she had turned around, Tally had only stared at her through cold eyes for no longer than a split second, telling Sarah everything she needed to know, telling her that Tally already knew, and that she was not happy about it. Then she had turned around and had engaged Abigail in some sort of conversation, making clear that she wanted nothing more to do with any of this, wanting nothing more to do with Sarah. And at that moment, Sarah had realized that she had made a huge mistake, one that she wouldn't be able to fix. So she had once more not walked towards Tally, had not wrapped her arms around her, and had not made sure she was okay, but had instead headed to the interrogation room, ready to let her own feelings get fully consumed once more by the case that had taken everything from her. Again, it was Nicta's voice that pulled her out of her thoughts and back to reality. Listen, Sarah. I don't know what internal conflict is currently happening inside of your head, but I need you to jump over your own goddamn shadow. Don't let the past dictate your life any longer. For fuck's sake, Sarah, I see you and Craven every day, and no offense, but it's making me sick how perfect you two are for each other. So get your ass out of that chair and tell the girl how you really feel, or I swear to Goddess I'm going to drag you there myself. After Nicta had finished her passionate speech, there was a moment of stunned silence. Sarah didn't quite know what to say. For the first time in her life, was beginning to ask herself why she kept resisting what her heart so desperately wanted. Then she reacted on instinct. She grabbed her jacket, basically jumped out of her chair, and within seconds was out of the bar and on her way through the streets of Boston, leaving a smirking Nicta behind. The detective simply reached for her glass and cheered to herself. Well, guess that means I'm paying. Tally was already in her pajamas, ready for another restless night, desperate to forget everything that had happened today. Alder walking her to her sister's grave. Alder still not being able to admit what she was feeling for Tally. Tally finally putting herself first, and then ultimately, Tally making yet again a fool of herself in front of almost the entire police department. It had been a lot. Definitely too much for her fragile little heart to take. She was just tired. So incredibly tired. And the fact that she already knew sleep wouldn't come easy that night didn't make her feel any better. She was just about to lie down when the sound of the doorbell made her jump. She reached for her backup weapon that she had become accustomed to carrying around since she had been kidnapped, then padded barefoot through the hallway, where she placed the gun in reaching distance on the counter next to the door. Tally hesitated for another moment, but when the doorbell rang once more, she reached out for the door handle. She didn't really know who to expect in the middle of the night, and when she carefully opened the door, gasped surprise when she looked directly into the striking blue eyes of Sarah Alder. Her partner looked like she had walked several miles to get to her apartment. Her eyes were wide, her cheeks slightly pink, and some streaks of hair had fallen out of her usually neat braid. Tally was instantly alarmed. "Alder? What's going on?" If Alder heard the panic in her voice, she ignored it completely. She hesitated only for the briefest of moments, but then the words started to tumble out of her mouth. "You were wrong earlier today, when you said I got exactly what I wanted." The sharp tone in Alder's voice made Tally jump. She was almost spitting the next words at the younger woman, who was watching her through big eyes. "You have no idea what I want, Craven." She slowly stepped closer, so close that their noses were almost touching. Yet Tally didn't back down. Instead, her own eyes turned slightly darker, and her voice resembled a low growl. "Then tell me, Detective Alder, what do you want?" She knew she was challenging Alder again, and half expected her to pull away now. But to her surprise, her partner didn't. In fact, she returned Tally's intense stare and made sure Tally didn't miss a single word of what she was about to say. "You," she almost whined. "I want you, okay? I've wanted you since the moment you spilled your damn coffee all over my shirt. I want you, Tally Craven. I want you so much that the thought of not being with you scares me more than 1,000 ways I could mess this up. The idea of letting anyone close to me is terrifying, for obvious reasons. But the truth, Tally, is that I can't imagine waking up knowing that I won't see you. The truth is, Her voice broke completely now. "I'm in love with you." And that was when the rational part of Tally's brain stopped working completely. She lunged forward, grabbed Sarah by her jacket, and pulled her into the apartment. She barely registered the door falling shut behind them, then immediately pressed Sarah against it and captured her lips in a desperate kiss. Sarah released a small gasp when their lips finally touched, surprised by the intensity and the lack of hesitation on Tally's side, but she recovered quickly and returned the kiss with just as much passion. It wasn't a pretty kiss. It was messy, teeth clashing against each other, hands desperately searching for contact, heavy breathing interrupted by small whimpers. But to Tally, it felt like the most beautiful thing in the world. She felt Sarah leaning in further, pressing her body tightly against Tally, and encouraged by her reaction, Tally playfully bit into Sarah's lower lip. The surprised moan she received in response went straight between her legs, and Tally used it as an opportunity to let her tongue slip into Sarah's mouth, pulling her in even closer, desperate to draw another one of these delicious moans from her partner. Sarah chuckled, then drew back slightly, giving both of them a moment to breathe. "A little eager, aren't we?" she teased, but her own eyes had already turned dark with desire. "You have no idea," Tally breathed. "Trust me when I tell you that I do." Then Sarah hesitated for a brief moment, suddenly very much aware of the fact that she was making out with Tally in the middle of the hallway of her shared apartment. "Where are Abigail and—" "Out with Adil and Scylla," Tally interrupted her impatiently. Then her lips were back on Sarah's. Tally guided him through the hallway and towards her bedroom, without interrupting the contact with Sarah's lips again. She was a little surprised by her own bluntness, but she was already too far gone to care. As soon as they reached her bedroom, however, Sarah seemed to have recovered from Tally's attack and slowly took over control. She let her hands wander below Tally's shirt, and when her hands made contact with the bare skin of Tally's stomach, she gasped loudly. Sarah took this as a sign to continue with her exploration. Her hands slowly moved up and down Tally's sides, and her lips started to wander along Tally's jaw, onto her neck, leaving a trail of hot kisses behind. Tally shivered when Sarah reached a particularly sensitive spot right behind her ear, and when Sarah noticed her reaction, she bit down gently, drawing a silent cry from Tally. But she didn't even have time to be embarrassed about her body's strong reaction, and the fact that this was the most turned on she had ever been in her entire life, when Sarah hadn't even touched her properly yet. Sarah guided her backward until she could feel her legs colliding with their mattress. Gently, but firm, Alder pushed her back, and out of reflex, Tally reached for her wrist, pulling her down onto the bed with her. Sarah let out a surprised yelp, but recovered fairly quick. With one swift movement, she lifted her leg and sat on top of Tally, pinning her down to the mattress. For a moment, they both took in the image in front of them, and Tally thought she could never get tired of the sight of Sarah on top of her, hair completely messy, eyes almost black with need and desire. But then Sarah leaned forward and started to caress Tally's breasts through her thin fabric of her shirt, and Tally stopped thinking completely. Her hips buckled when Sarah started to draw small circles around her nipples, and she closed her eyes, releasing another loud moan. Sarah seemed to take this as an invitation to continue, and Tally felt her hands playing with the fabric of her shirt. She lifted her upper body slightly, and within seconds, her shirt was pulled over her head, leaving her in nothing but her panties. Before Tally had fully processed what was happening, Alder's lips were back on her body, biting the soft skin of her breasts hard enough to leave some marks behind. Then, almost apologetically, her tongue started to circle one of Tally's nipples, and Tally felt like her whole body was on fire. She lifted her hips, desperate for any sort of friction, and the frustration inside of her only grew when suddenly the pressure of Alder's tongue vanished from her breasts. She opened her eyes and blinked in confusion. Sarah was sitting upright again, and while her eyes were still filled with desire, Tally also spotted something else inside of them. Something she wouldn't have expected. Insecurity. Sarah? Her own voice was shaking lightly. Sarah lowered her head and searched Tally's gaze. Tally, are you sure? Tally felt her heart clench at the softness in Sarah's voice. She knew that she wanted to give Tally a chance to stop this, to end this before they moved any further, before Sarah could somehow mess this up and hurt Tally again. And maybe Tally should do just that, stop this, before it had even really begun. She wasn't sure about any of this, wasn't sure Sarah wouldn't just drop her again, wasn't sure how things would develop between them after tonight. But the one thing she was sure of was that all of this felt so incredibly right, that Sarah felt so incredibly right, and that she couldn't just walk away from this. And so she simply returned Sarah's gaze, and her reply came without the slightest trace of doubt. Yes. Then she gently pulled Sarah down again, and planted another heated kiss on her lips. She could feel the slightest hesitation in the way Sarah returned her kiss, but when she exploratively let her own hands wander below Sarah's shirt, her insecurity seemed to fade away. Soon her hands were back on Tally's breasts, and with each of Sarah's touches, with each of her kisses, Tally's breath quickened a little bit more. When Alder interrupted their kiss once more, any last bit of resistance was gone. She looked down at Tally, let her eyes wander appreciatingly up and down her body, and her fingers traced her abs with feather-like touches, leaving a trail of goosebumps behind. "Do you have any idea how beautiful you are?" she whispered huskily. "I could spend all day sitting here, just watching you." "Don't you dare," Tally managed to press out between gritted teeth. This drew a throaty laugh from Sarah, and for a split second, her fingers moved below the waistband of Tally's panties. Then they were gone again, and Tally released a frustrated groan. "Patience, my dear," Sarah muttered teasingly. "My patience was gone the second you showed up at the ball in that stupid suit." Sarah raised her eyebrow provokingly. "Oh, I thought you would like that. Tally couldn't resist rolling her eyes at the comment. Once more she tried to push up her hips, to bring them somewhat closer to Sarah's body, in hope of release. She looked up at Alder, almost pleadingly. Sarah, please. Please what? Please fuck me. That finally seemed to do the trick for Sarah, and she quickly removed Tally's panties. Then she leaned forward, and while her teeth were gently nibbling on the sensitive skin of Tally's neck, her hand finally moved down her body, and between Tally's legs, groaning when she first made contact with the wetness awaiting her. She started to draw small circles around Tally's clit, and Tally almost whined at the contact. Sarah moved her body slightly, locking her eyes with Tally's once more. Then, Tally started to speak with a shaky voice. Can you say it again? Say what again? But Tally could no longer form words and only moaned in response. Sarah understood her anyway. She lowered her voice until it was barely more than a heavy whisper. I'm in love with you, Tally Craven. Then she let two of her fingers slide inside of Tally, and a small scream escaped her. Sarah started to thrust into Tally, slowly at first, but when she felt her body responding to her touch, her movements soon became faster, harder. With every thrust, Tally moans became louder, her breathing shallower. Then Sarah curled her fingers slightly, and Tally bit down her own lip in pleasure. Fuck, right there. Encouraged by her reaction, Sarah repeated her movement, and Tally felt herself tipping over the edge. She let out one last long moan. Then she came, with Sarah's name on her lips. Her whole body twisted uncontrollably, and she needed a moment until the waves of pleasure were slowly fading. She closed her eyes and sank back into the mattress, slowly trying to get her breathing back under control. Then she felt Sarah's presence beside her, her lips ghosting over her ear. I hope this was as good as in all of your dreams. Tally's eyes flew open. How do you know about the dreams? Her partner only chuckled, lazily letting her hand wander through Tally's hair. I didn't, not until now. Then her voice dropped even lower. But let me reassure you, you are not the only one having dreams like that. And I can't wait to turn each and every single one of them into reality. Sarah's words sent another wave of arousal through Tally's body. With a force she didn't know she possessed, she sat up and turned Sarah around, so that it was now her lying on the mattress, and Tally pinning her down. She kissed her passionately, then made quick work of removing Sarah's clothes. Soon she was completely naked, and just like Sarah before, Tally took a moment to appreciate the image in front of her. Sarah was a masterpiece, one that Tally desperately needed to get her fingers on. She experimentally let her hands wander down to Sarah's breasts. Her fingertips lightly grazed against Sarah's nipples, and when the contact drew a tight moan from her, Tally repeated the movement, until both nipples were completely stiff and Sarah was panting heavily below her. Tally was surprised by her own certainty. She had never slept with a woman before, had never even thought about it until Sarah Alder had entered her life, and, the hurricane that she was, had blown away every bit of her heterosexuality. Still, touching Sarah like that felt like the most natural thing in the world for her. She had no real idea what she was doing, and of course there was a bit of insecurity. But that insecurity had nothing to do with the situation itself. Instead, she simply didn't know what Sarah liked, which put a certain pressure on her because she wanted nothing more than to make Sarah feel just as good as she had felt only minutes ago. But that wasn't uncertainty. Tally could easily get rid of. She leaned forward and placed a feather-light kiss on top of Sarah's breast. Then she let her lips wander up her neck, her throat, her jaw, could feel Sarah's body vibrating under her touch. Her lips reached Sarah's ear, and she whispered quietly, Tell me what you need. Sarah moaned. Get your mouth back on my breasts. Take one of my nipples into your mouth. Tally followed Sarah's instructions, and when she let her teeth graze along Sarah's nipple, her body jerked up and Sarah sighed loudly. Moments later, Tally could feel Alder's hand closing around her wrist. She slowly started to move Tally's hand down her own body, and Tally looked up, slightly confused by Sarah's actions. "Let me guide you. I will show you what I need." Realization hit Tally, and she nodded silently. Sarah took control over Tally's hand and moved it slowly between her own legs. Tally hesitated for a moment when she realized just how wet Sarah was. "All for me?" she whispered. "Only for you." Sarah's husky response drew another grasp from Tally. She started to move her fingers between Sarah's legs. Sarah moaned in response, then guided Tally's hands even lower. Tally understood, and let two of her fingers slide inside her. Sarah released her grasp when Tally started to thrust into her with fast, hard strokes. She repeated the movement a couple of times, then felt all her slightly shaky fingers back on her wrist. She stopped and looked up again, suddenly afraid she was doing something wrong, but Sarah reassured her quickly. "If you continue with that pace, this will be over far too soon. We have all the time in the world." Tally reacted immediately and started to move her fingers slower. She continued to caress Sarah's breast with her lips and could hear her moans becoming louder and more desperate. She turned her hand slightly so that now her palm was pushing against Sarah's clit with each of her thrusts. Then, she gently bit down on one of Sarah's nipples, and that seemed to do the trick for her. Tally felt her body tensing up. Sarah let out a small cry, and then her whole body started to twitch around Tally's fingers. She continued to move her fingers inside of Sarah slowly, letting her ride out the wave of her orgasms, and when her body finally calmed and dropped out onto the pillow beside her, she was searching Alder's gaze and found her eyes still slightly clouded with lust. Now it was Tally's turn to tease. "So, Detective Alder, did my performance satisfy you?" Sarah groaned at the mention of her title, but still managed a teasing wing that was almost enough for Tally to bury her fingers back inside of her. "No complaints from my side, Detective Craven." "Now that's a first," Tally joked. Her partner playfully slapped her arm, and soon both of them were laughing. Sarah pulled Tally closer to her, and when she buried her head in the dark hair with a content sigh, she could feel the exhaustion of the day finally hitting her. Sarah's warm body beside her, and the calming feeling of her hand gently grazing her hair, was enough to make her eyelids feel heavy, and soon sleep had washed over her. For the first time in weeks, Tally slept through the whole night, without nightmares torturing her. When she woke up, she was well rested, and had almost forgotten what that felt like. Then memories from last night came flooding back to her, and a tiny smile appeared on her face when she remembered the way Sarah had touched her. That smile, however, froze in place when Tally realized moments later that the spot next to her was empty, Sarah nowhere to be seen. She lifted her head and was ready to let her disappointment take her over once more, but then paused, and the already boiling disappointment was quickly replaced with a wave of relief when she spotted a familiar head of messy black hair standing in front of one of her drawers. Tally gulped when she realized that, except for one of the oversized flannels that barely reached up her ass, Sarah Alder was completely naked. "Like what you see?" Sarah's teasing voice made Tally's head snap up, and her cheeks reddened immediately. "How did you—" she stuttered. "I'm a cop, remember?" Then she turned around, and when Tally spotted that she was holding in her hands, she immediately buried her head in her pillow and groaned. Still, she could hear the rustling sound of paper, and Sarah went through the items she was holding. "I didn't mean to be nosy, but I spotted these lying on top of your drawer when I wanted to go to the toilet. That's a nice little collection of articles you have there, Craven. It seems like you have quite the crush on that cop mentioned in them. But I have to say, half of the pictures are not doing me justice." She laughed quietly at her own joke, and Tally wanted to die on the spot. "You were never supposed to see this, but it's not like you gave me much of a warning when you barged in here last night. I didn't have much time to clean up," Tally muttered grumpily. "Last time I checked, you didn't seem too upset about it." Tally could practically hear Sarah's grin through her words. It was driving her insane. "Well, neither were you." "Indeed. She made a small pause, and Tally almost thought that would be it. But then Sarah continued talking. Now about those articles. Tally pulled back the covers and groaned in frustration. Shut up and get back into bed. The amused twinkle in Sarah's eyes was more present than ever. Still, she knew better than to antagonize Tally any further and raised her hands in defeat. Your wish is my command, Detective Craven. Then she placed the articles back on the drawer, and with 3 quick steps she was standing beside the bed and slipped under the blankets beside Tally. Tally turned away from her and pretended to ignore her, but she felt Sarah's arms wrap around her naked torso. She involuntarily leaned into her embrace. Then Sarah's lips were on her shoulder blade, planting a feather-light kiss on it. A small sigh escaped Tally, and she hated how much her voice was shaking with arousal already when she started to speak. Can I wish for something else? Sarah only hummed in response and started to kiss her way up to Tally's neck. Her hands wandered fully around Tally's body, and her fingers were gently kneading her breasts. I want you to, Tally managed to press out. Yes, Tally. What do you want me to do? Sarah whispered, sending another shiver through Tally's body. But before Tally could reply, the shrill sound of Sarah's phone pulled them out of their bubble. Just let it ring, Tally groaned, but could already feel Sarah's body moving behind her. Yes, Sarah barked into the phone, her voice all professional. Then Tally could feel her whole body stiffen. How's that possible? Tally turned around, worry written all over her face, but Sarah was already out of bed and on her way to get dressed, the phone still pressed to her ear. We're on our way. She ended the call, and when she raised her head to look at Tally, all color had left her face. Sarah? Tally whispered quietly. What happened? She watched Sarah's shoulders drop, and her hollow-sounding words felt like a slap in Tally's face. There's another body. It looks like the Camarilla killer found a new victim, last night, when Kara Brand was already safe and sound in our custody. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.